Up until now, the systems we've looked at have not been particularly widespread. In this episode, we're going to change that and look at the most common form of urban rail transit in the United States. If you live in an American city large enough to go head to head with like Minneapolis, then yours is probably one of many that have built light rail in the last few decades. Unlike other forms of transit we've talked about before, like metros, inclines, legacy streetcars, probably modern streetcars too, the era of light rail isn't over yet. After 40 years, light rail is still under active development across the United States. One reason for that is it's much cheaper than the alternatives. At an average cost of $100 million per mile, it comes in a lot cheaper than heavy rapid transit, which cost about $500 million per mile in the same time period. Even though it's still more expensive than most high-quality bus projects, there is just a sort of je ne sais quoi to having a train gliding through your city that attracts new development around stations, which then attracts local political support. Since 2010, light rail has received more federal transit funding than any other category of transit. But light rail has proved more popular with planners and the Federal Transportation Administration than with the public. Even with all this new infrastructure, light rail has only picked up 30 million new riders since 2010. In contrast, just 26 new miles of heavy rail metros built in the same time frame gained 174 million new riders. While light rail might be cheaper to build per mile, if you instead measure the cost per new rider, suddenly it's the more expensive option. So if it costs more per rider, why aren't we just building that sweet heavy rail? What even is light and heavy rail? Is one train way more than the other? Light and heavy rail just refer to how much traffic the mode of transport can carry. Heavy rapid transit in North America is what we would colloquially call subways. Large electric trains running completely separate from road traffic, like the New York City subway, Chicago L, or DC Metro.
Defining light rail is difficult. One of the better definitions out there is from the Independent Government Advisory Transportation Research Board.
A mode of urban transportation utilizing predominantly reserved but not necessarily grade-separated rights-of-way. Electrically propelled rail vehicles operate singly or in trains. Light rail provides a wide range of passenger capabilities and performance characteristics at moderate costs.
Like many definitions of light rail, this one is broad and vague enough to include a lot of transit that is definitely not light rail. Most of the modern streetcar systems that I covered in the first Failure and Success video and the legacy streetcars that predate light rail both fall into this definition to some degree. So what does define light rail? I have some common characteristics, but you're going to see there are a lot of exceptions. Light rail is flexible in nature, so sometimes you just have to apply a Potter-Stewart test, and you know it when you see it.
To help show what is light rail, let's bring in Supreme Court Justice Potter-Stewart to play Do You Know Light Rail When You See It? I'll tell you what sets light rail apart, then show you a picture of a system, and then Justice Potter-Stewart will tell us if it's light rail or not. Let's go. Light rail generally has dedicated lanes, whether they're underground, elevated, or on street level. So Justice Stewart, is this light rail? Yes, that's correct. This is Portland's Max Light Rail in a dedicated lane. Okay, Potter-Stewart, is this light rail? Correct, that is not light rail. That is the Salt Lake City S-Line streetcar, which runs only on dedicated tracks, but it's still a streetcar. Dedicated lanes alone do not define light rail. And what about this, Justice Stewart? Is this light rail running in the street here? That's right, it still is. It's Sacramento's RT light rail. And like many light rail systems, it has short portions where it mixes with car traffic, but it's still light rail. Light rail will generally have larger stations with more infrastructure than streetcars. So Justice Stewart, is this light rail? That's correct. This is Seattle's Link Light Rail in one of its downtown subway stations. So what about this one? That's right. This is not light rail. It's one of Philadelphia's subway surface streetcars that predate light rail and have large underground stations. Okay, Justice Potter-Stewart, this one is tricky.
Which one of these trains is a light rail train and which one is a streetcar? Correct, the Siemens S70 on the left is Charlotte's Blue Line, and on the right is also a Siemens S70, the most popular light rail vehicle in America, but it is Atlanta's streetcar. Vehicles used by light rail and streetcars are almost always interchangeable. So with this much overlap, what really sets light rail apart? The best metric that we have is overall route length and distance between stations. Light rail systems are designed for intermediate distance travel like commuting, whereas streetcars are extremely, oftentimes painfully local. Most modern systems are only a few miles in length with stop space similarly to bus stops. So what does a light rail system look like in practice? Introducing the City of Washburn's light rail system, WARTLink. Why do so many light rail systems have link in the name? I honestly don't know the answer to this one. I think it's one of life's great mysteries. WARTLink is made up of 3 lines total with 22 stations serving the city. So how was the system developed? And what would make a city choose to invest in light rail? What are the differences between this and the other forms of rail transit we've looked at for Washburn, like a metro system? Let's take it back a few decades and dig into that history.
Light rail is an indirect descendant of historic streetcar systems. I did a video last year about the early history of streetcars that left off around 1920. I'm planning on doing a follow-up to it about the decline of streetcars. The great part about YouTube is that you say you'll make these videos one day. Remember to like the smash and subscribe bell. This light rail video could be thought of as a sequel to the video about the decline of streetcars I will maybe someday probably make, forming a sort of life, death, and rebirth of the form. In the United States in the 1960s, the last stragglers of the streetcar era were shutting down, and it looked like there wasn't a very bright future for transit. At the same time, though, engineers in this country were obsessed with the hottest European fashions in trains. In 1962, Henry Dean Quimby, a transportation engineer who had worked for the firm Parsons Brinkerhoff on new heavy rail rapid transit projects like BART in San Francisco and the Skokie Swift in Chicago, wrote into an academic transportation journal called Traffic Quarterly with an article titled Major Urban Corridor Facilities, a New Concept, in which he proposed a new concept for facilities along major urban corridors. During the 1950s, Quimby had traveled extensively through Europe, observing mass transit operations, and when he came back, Quimby participated in the long American tradition of telling everyone all about all the cool trains he saw and how easy it was to go places in Europe and how we need to be a bit more like that. Quimby observed that American cities essentially had 2 forms of urban transit: slow decaying local bus routes and high-speed, high-capacity, heavy rail transit. He proposed that there was a missing form of transit in between these two that would be higher capacity and faster than a bus, but cheaper and shorter in distance than a heavy rail metro. To fill that purpose, Quimby proposed that American cities adopt what he called rapid tramways that were being developed in Western Europe, primarily in the Rhine-Ruhr region of Germany. In the post-war period, European cities had struggled with the same transportation issues that American cities had faced in the 1930s. Car ownership was increasing, and the existing streetcars that ran on roads were being slowed by traffic, which began the spiral of declining ridership. In American cities, streetcars were almost always replaced with buses that continued to lose ridership, and again, I'll cover the extinction of streetcars in the future. Was it General Motors? Was it highways? Was it Judge Doom? But in many European cities, there wasn't the same decline in streetcars, and Quimby noted the improvements that had been made. Streetcar tracks were shifted to dedicated lanes, center medians, or off of roads entirely to remove them from traffic. Small local stops were combined into farther apart stations, and streetcar vehicles were replaced with multi-vehicle or articulated trains.
Quimby estimated the rapid tramway concept would carry twice as many passengers as an American streetcar and almost 4 times as many as a diesel bus. In his conclusion, Quimby argued that the advancements in European trams had constituted a new form of transit entirely, a modern successor to the streetcar. The rest of the 1960s was pretty stagnant for American light rail development. A couple more proposals were put into journals like Traffic Quarterly, but light rail was not pursued in any cities. Development in Europe did continue. The German rapid tramway concept was formalized into the Stadtbahn, direct translation city rail, and then into the concept of pre-metros, where tram lines would be put into subway tunnels in the city center that were built to metro standards, and then the periphery lines would be progressively upgraded until it eventually reached the standards of a rapid transit metro system. American transit development has always kind of struggled with this kind of incremental improvement. My video on metro systems covers the early urban mass transportation administration through the 1960s. Federal transit policy was focused heavily on all new technologically advanced heavy rail systems like BART and the Washington Metro rather than upgrades to existing transit systems. By the early 1970s, the Urban Mass Transportation Administration was facing a dilemma. In 1970, Congress had allocated $3.1 billion in transit funding for the next 5 years. With costs exploding on metro systems under development, it was pretty quickly evident that funding was going to fall far short of demand if cities continued pursuing heavy rapid transit. So in 1972, the UMTA commissioned a report on light rail by University of Pennsylvania professor of transportation engineering Vucek. Vucek is sort of a legendary figure in transit. He has probably had more groundbreaking transit proposals ignored than pretty much anybody alive. The guy is pushing 90, but still finds time to write op-eds about whatever the latest screw-up in Philadelphia transit is, and, true to form, SEPTA ignores him every time. When it comes to U.S. transit policy, Vucek really is the
King, you dropped this.
Vucek put together a report on light rail entitled Light Rail Transit Systems, a Definition and Evaluation. First, he solidified the term light rail over other terms like rapid tramway or limited tram line. Light rail is an adaptation of German Stadtbahn, city rail, mixed with the British term light railway, which was a regulatory class of railroad built to a lower standard and at a lower cost than regular railways. Vucek pulled statistics from the last 20 years of transit ridership and found that while buses had shed millions of riders, ridership on rapid transit lines had remained stable. This echoed what Quimby had said, that American transit was stratified into two extremes. The uncomfortable, slow local bus, whose riders received disinvested second-class service and left the bus as soon as they could afford to, and more comfortable rail transit that was fast enough to even beat driving in some cities. The position that Vucek took in his report was that the basic premise of metros had been right. High-quality transit, separated from traffic, was the only transit that would draw riders out of cars. A strong principle behind metros, though, was that improvements to transit needed to be new and technologically advanced. Vucek argued that the metro proponents had been incorrect about this, and that instead, the greatest immediate benefits in transit can certainly be achieved through modernization of our existing, badly neglected and obsolete transit systems and facilities, and through introduction of innovative methods of operation which utilize basically standard technologies. One of these standard technologies would be light rail. He then went on to make the connection between the few surviving streetcar systems in Newark, Boston, Philly, Pittsburgh, San Francisco, and Cleveland, and European light rail, and pointed out that we already sort of had our own template for light rail in these cities. Vucek finished by reiterating what Quimby and others had said, that American cities should pursue the light rail developed in Europe as a way to more cost-effectively expand transit in less dense cities. After Vucek's report was released, the UMTA looked to market the idea of light rail to cities and hosted the National Light Rail Conference in Philadelphia in 1975. The Light Rail Conference had unexpectedly high attendance because a bunch of hardcore trolley enthusiasts
hopeful to hear about the restoration of extinct streetcar services, shacked up in nearby college dorms to crash the conference.
They should restore it and run it on the main line. God bless.
That aside, though, the conference was considered a success, and many of the transit and planning professionals in attendance returned home with the message of light rail. So that about wraps up the history class. Let's head on back to Washburn and we'll see how a city ends up with light rail.
There's an important decision moment that we visited in 2 previous episodes, deciding whether or not to pursue a heavy rail metro system. In the Metros episode, a voter referendum was passed to provide local funds to match federal funding for building such a system, but in the Busways episode, we took a different timeline and that referendum failed and transit expansions were kicked down the road a decade. In our scenario today, light rail is going to follow a similar divergence. The 1970 rapid transit referendum fails, and plans for transit go dormant. This was a real decision that cities made too. In Seattle, a voter referendum on a heavy rail rapid transit system failed in 1970, and it would be over 25 years before voters approved new funding for light rail. Washburn's turnaround is going to be a little faster. The local transit leaders attended the National Light Rail Conference in 1975 and heard the good word about light rail. Planners at the Washburn Area Rapid Transit System dusted off the plans from the 1960s for a metro system and re-examined them in the context of trying to build out a similar system, but for a much lower cost as light rail. This was a common feature of early light rail systems. San Diego, Buffalo, Los Angeles, and Baltimore all were planned originally as heavy rail and then altered for cost reasons. By 1980, there was enough political momentum to bring another transit plan to voters. Federal funding had gotten stingier, though, in the decade since the last referendum. After costs spiraled on the great metros of DC and Atlanta, the feds were no longer willing to fund entire systems. Voters had been asked to supply 20% of the funds for an $850 million system in 1970. Now, they would be asked to provide the same percentage, but for a much smaller $150 million starter line that would then be gradually extended into a full light rail network. Voters approved the more modest plan, and construction starts in 1981. Unlike the metro systems of the 1970s, the light rail systems of the 80s largely did not face the extraordinary cost overruns and were built in a pretty timely fashion. Inflation was much lower in the 80s, and accessible stations were factored in from the start. And in general, the nuts and bolts of figuring out how to build a rail transit project after decades of neglect in that area have been worked out by the metro systems. In 1984, our first light rail line opens on time and close to budget. This east-west line starts in the downtown, where it runs in either mixed traffic or in a dedicated lane, and moving out of the downtown, it gets a more dedicated means of travel in the median of an arterial road, and then it enters a completely separated right-of-way operating alongside a freight rail corridor with park and ride suburban stations. This line demonstrates the versatility of light rail. Transit corridors can be pieced together from a variety of sources, and there's not one single standard to follow. This versatility is great for cost savings, but it sometimes also comes at the cost of ridership. Running in mixed traffic downtown means not having to buy up expensive land, but it also slows the trains down to a crawl. And using a freight corridor in an urban neighborhood can be a cheap way to reuse an existing right-of-way, but often the land surrounding freight rail was used for industrial purposes, and so there's few sources of riders or destinations that they want to go to along that line.
A crucial part of the new light rail system is the vehicles that run on it. And for a system opening in the 1980s, there were a handful of options. There was a robust European market for light rail vehicles, but that was mostly inaccessible to systems trying to purchase vehicles using federal grant money. In 1971, before light rail systems opened, 3 of the remaining streetcar subway systems, San Francisco's Muni, Philadelphia's SEPTA, and Boston's MBTA, were in need of replacement for their decades-old PCC streetcars they were still using that had been built in the 1940s. The systems tried to buy European vehicles, but Nixon created the Buy America policy that same year, and since the Urban Mass Transportation Administration was going to fund the new purchases, the new vehicles would have to be built domestically, the same domestic market where a streetcar hadn't been built in 20 years. To make a new vehicle viable, the UMTA requested that the three systems combine their purchases to create an order large enough that somebody would be interested. And that somebody turned out to be defense contractors looking for work amid the winding down war in Vietnam. Boeing ultimately won the contract and in 1972 began building a new vehicle in Philadelphia called the U.S. Standard Light Rail Vehicle. So one option would be to buy Standard Light Rail Vehicles, or SLRVs. But there was a bit of a problem. They were horrible. Boeing's project managers had viewed themselves in their own words as bearers of high technology, and so making a slow little train should be no issue. Teams of aerospace engineers were assembled, and to make sure this point is clear, nobody involved had any experience working on a train. A ton of development was outsourced to companies in countries with more transit experience. As a result, though, it was really difficult to source parts for maintenance. And the SLRV was really difficult to maintain in general. It hadn't actually been designed with maintenance in mind. Some parts couldn't even be removed without hacking away at it with a welding torch. Difficult maintenance was made worse by the fact that they just broke so much. There were issues with the electronics, the doors were finicky and would repeatedly open and close until they broke, and the cars were breaking down 15 times more frequently than the German vehicles that San Diego had purchased without federal money. So many SLRVs broke down that after Boston started receiving their order, disabled SLRVs were hidden in subway tunnels to be cannibalized for parts until so many were broken they ultimately had to be stored in yards in view of the public and the press, who soon found out about the issues. After court settlements forced Boeing to address the issues, the steel frame cars began corroding less than a decade into their life. Ultimately, the federal government shortened their declared lifespan from 25 years to 15 years to allow Boston and San Francisco to retire them early. So knowing this, Washburn's light rail planners opted to pursue what other 80s light rail systems did and find ways to purchase internationally produced vehicles.
WARTLink's vehicles are Siemens Duog U2s, the same that were purchased by San Diego and the new Canadian light rail systems in Edmonton and Calgary. To meet Buy America requirements, factories had to be set up in the US, which raised the cost. And this is still the way we buy light rail trains in America in the year of our Lord 2021. 40 years after the failure of the standard light rail vehicle, there is no light rail manufacturing industry in the United States. Most of our vehicles come from Germany or Japan at an inflated price. With one line open in Washburn, where does light rail go from here? Well, light rail is really easy to expand. To expand a heavy rapid transit system, each mile of new rail needs to be the same quality as the rest of the system. Expansions are very expensive, and they're limited in what areas they can easily go. And light rail systems have been expanded a lot. Remember at the start, I said that almost 200 miles of light rail have been built in just the last 10 years. Almost every single light rail system built was done in the starter line piecemeal extension model. So WARTLink gets a bunch of extensions. A natural first one is the north-south line running through the downtown, and similar to the route that we took in the busway in the last episode and in the metro from a while ago. Again, it makes sense that the route is similar to other transit plans we've had. Failed metro plans were commonly recycled into light rail. This line opens 9 years later in 1993. It begins south of the downtown with a station and a highway median, making a distant connection to the Amtrak station. On its north end, the line ended at a station for the Science Center, the same one that I mentioned in the streetcars episode. Through the downtown, the light rail runs in dedicated lanes, but on the street surface. One of the principles of European light rail and pre-metros had been that the initial phase should include putting a tunnel through the city center to get transit off of congested streets. American light rails never really followed this principle that closely. Upgrades to older streetcars included some tunnels. Pittsburgh streetcar was put into a subway tunnel in the downtown during its light rail upgrade in the 1980s, and San Francisco's Muni had a tunnel built beneath Market Street alongside the construction of BART. A handful of new systems have some tunneling. Seattle makes the most use of tunneling since it inherited a downtown bus tunnel that was converted to light rail, and Los Angeles has some light rail subways. Buffalo, New York really told the Europeans to go themselves by putting its new light rail on streets with cars in the downtown and then blowing so much money tunneling under the suburbs that they couldn't afford to finish the line. Choosing to forego downtown tunnels was an obvious cost-cutting choice, maybe mixed with the pessimism that American light rail would never have high enough ridership to justify an expensive but faster subway, and unfortunately this is becoming a limitation of some of our systems. Portland's light rail crawls through the downtown at just 7 miles per hour, making stops at stations less than 500 feet apart, and the stations themselves are issues. Each station is only as long as a city block, and Portland famously has very small 200-foot long blocks, so trains are limited in their length, and that limits the entire capacity of the system. And the same has happened in Dallas, where all 4 lines of the city's light rail share the same downtown trunk on the surface, and now the city is preparing to invest nearly $2 billion in a subway project to alleviate that congestion. This isn't really meant to be a dig at those cities. The real dig is the one they're going to have to do to bury those trains. When they built their original light rail systems, the political capital and funding just didn't exist for new subway tunnels, and none of the cities building light rail had a culture of transit ridership yet that would necessitate it. But cost-saving shortcuts are a limitation built into systems that are going to have to be faced in the future. In Washburn, the next extension opens in 2002, with 2 new stations on the north-south line terminating at the airport. 8 light rail systems in the US serve their airports, and several more are under construction or in the planning stages, so airports are a pretty popular light rail connection. Airports aren't a great source of ridership though, and they can require running trains at weird hours. So while they may be politically popular, care needs to be taken to make the airport line useful to riders other than airline passengers. Serving airport employees should be a top priority, along with making stops along the way to the airport. Moving much further down the list of useful transit extensions, we come to the 2004 expansion of WARTLink to the stadium across the river from downtown Washburn. This stadium, on a redeveloped brownfield site, gets extremely large and extremely infrequent crowds, which makes it a dubious case for an expensive light rail extension crossing the river. But nonetheless, the city pursued the plan like many cities did, chasing connections that most of their citizens would rarely use, but tourists could find useful. And the final extension that brings us to the modern day layout of WARTLink is a branch of the north-south line that opened in 2014, extending the northern terminus to a suburban mall. This extension is funded in a similar way to streetcar systems that we discussed in the first episode of the series, using new starts or small starts federal funding schemes that incentivize small transit systems and extensions. I didn't put together a cost for this extension, but based on the trends in the latest generation of light rail construction, it would probably be expensive. Light rail projects in the United States have been rapidly escalating in cost. Minneapolis's 15-mile Green Line extension will be about $140 million per mile. And Maryland's Purple Line will cost about $150 million a mile. And then in San Diego, famous for opening its original light rail in 1981 at a cost of just $6 million a mile, is constructing a new extension that'll cost nearly $200 million per mile. With this final extension in place, let's look at how service on WARTLink works and who it serves. Our system has 3 lines now: the pink line, which is the first line that opened in the 1980s, and second is the green line that runs between the airport, downtown, and the stadium, and this is the tourist train. And finally, the gold line that runs between the mall and the downtown. These lines run from early morning to late night. There are no 24/7 light rail systems in the US, except for a shuttle service to Minneapolis' airport. Again, airports have some weird hours. Now, for accessibility, all the stations in WARTLink are accessible. There's not a lot to say about light rail accessibility that differs from what I said about modern streetcars. Again, same technologies. All of our modern light rail systems existed in an era where federal dollars required accessible buildings, and many were built after the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Among the older light rail systems that were originally streetcar subways, accessibility is less universal. The reality is that most of these systems were never fully modernized to light rail standards, and one of the largest streetcar systems, Philadelphia, has only introduced modernization plans in the past several years. These systems still have stops with low platforms or no platforms, like Boston's Green Line or San Francisco's Terrible Line.
Alright, so there's one more important area that I want to cover before we wrap up, and that's frequency and service variation. I keep stressing the flexibility of light rail, and this is an area where that flexibility is a double-edged sword. Light rail can run a huge range of service levels, which is really cost effective, but it creates some subpar experiences. At peak morning and evening periods, most light rail systems top out at trains every 5 or 6 minutes, although there's a couple systems like DART in Dallas that have trains every 3 minutes. Outside of peak hours though, frequencies drop off really quickly. Most light rail systems in the US operate on 15 to 20 minute frequencies off peak, and it can be even worse on nights and weekends. American light rail systems have abysmally low frequencies by international standards, and it reflects in our ridership. A service that runs infrequently outside of peak hours is one that is not reliable to anybody who's not a 9 to 5 commuter. Office commuters are invariably wealthier and whiter than other riders, and systems that have a large discrepancy between peak and non-peak frequencies are not equitable transit systems. A light rail line stretching into low-density suburbs, receiving massive investment but operating primarily for commuters, while high ridership city bus lines languish in traffic, is a perpetuation of this inequity. Part of the reason why we have such poor frequencies outside of peak hours, though, is in how we fund transit. When the federal government gives money to transit, it's almost always for what we call capital expenses. Capital expenses are those that are usually for things we can see and touch and last a really long time, like building new track or stations or new vehicles, and sometimes maintenance is a capital expense. Sometimes it's not. It kind of just depends on how big and how broken things are. The bigger and brokener it is, the more likely it is to be capital. What the federal government does not give money for is operating expenses. Annual expenditures like labor, fuel, maintenance, all the costs that are necessary to make the system actually move. So transit operators are given large amounts of money to buy shiny new track and equipment, but then struggle to actually pay to run service that is useful to riders. In Vucic's 1972 report on light rail, he observed that what American transit needed was not new technologically advanced systems. This was the promise that metros had made, that a sufficiently advanced system would meet the needs of riders and draw them back from their cars. Extraordinary costs ultimately meant metros could not serve the vast majority of riders, and that promise failed. Light rail put forward a new proposal, that by using a simpler and more adaptable form, we could build enough transit that more riders would be within reach of a system. Light rail certainly did expand transit. There are hundreds more miles of rail transit now than when it first came on the scene in the 1970s. But light rail's failure so far has been that to simply spread rail across a city is not enough. We can't get out of this mess just by purchasing new trains. Again, to Vucic's point, the greatest improvement in transit that we can make is in operations, which includes operational funding. Most of my other videos are a bit of a post-mortem on types of transit that have long since gone extinct. For light rail, though, it's pretty much the only politically viable form of transit that we have, so addressing our shortcomings is essential. Going forward, American light rail systems need to expand in a cost-effective way, similar to the first light rail systems. This includes managing the cost of light rail vehicles that are artificially inflated from Buy America requirements. Our light rail systems need to follow routes that actually reach riders' destinations, and if they are routed through an unpopulated area, then housing needs to be built aggressively around stations. Finally, building high-quality light rail systems and then operating them on razor-thin budgets is not a viable approach to building a culture of transit. Infrequent service is not reliable, and it favors the inequitable model of prioritizing commuter needs. Growing ridership on our existing light rail systems depends on improving frequencies both on the train and on bus services connecting to it. There is some hope here. With a new presidential administration comes renewed calls to change rules so transit agencies can tap into federal funds to cover part or all of their operating costs. The Biden administration seems like it could be receptive to this, especially after including funding for operations in the COVID-19 relief package that was passed in early 2021. So there is hope for light rail to improve, and I'm optimistic that the continued development of the form will make it an integral part in building a culture of transit in small and medium cities.